Suit up, strap in, warm the tires, and leave on yellow. Time for the MitsuTimes podcast, presented by MitsuTimes.org, the home of the fastest Mitsubishi cars. With your host, Josh.
What's going on, guys? Welcome to a very special episode of the MitsuTimes podcast. My guest today is Mr. Tailor Shuma. He is the owner and I guess kind of one-man show, right, Taylor?
Yeah, for the most part.
And of our newest sponsor, TailorTuned, of our Evo 10 list. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm great. First off, I got to thank you for coming in and scooping up and saving the Evo 10 list. It was coming under some hard times, I guess is the best word for it. And it needed a savior. So you were the man for the job.
I'm hoping to do it well.
Yep.
So
we got some, I would say we had some good action for the Evo 10 list last year, and we're hoping to have some more action for the Evo 10 list later on in the year. It looks like Rafe and the boys are going to get the Evo 10 back out. And there's some really cool cars up there at the top of the list.
I'm hoping to have mine done by spring and then hopefully get on there myself. But we were testing the car and then had transmission issues, and I never really got a chance to submit a time with it.
You know, when I go to the track, Taylor, and I talk to Evo 10 guys, it seems like the fascination isn't towards the top of the list with most Evo 10 guys. It's kind of more towards the middle of the list where there's a lot of jockeying back and forth, and I think that's really unique for this list and something I find really cool.
Yeah, I think it's more competitive there just because the price point to be in like that top 5 or like the top 1%, let's call it,
right,
is a lot more expensive once you get to that level.
Yeah.
My car should be a mid to bottom 9 second, possibly 8s, depending on how much we turn it up. And I'm comfortable with it there because it's still a full weight, full interior AC car. Obviously, it's going to get caged and have a chute on it at some point, but it was my street car for most of its life. And it actually used to be the old shop car for Co Performance, who I'm the calibrator for. And I bought the car from Kyle when he was done with it because he bought the Evo 8 that's 4B11 swapped.
Yeah.
And that's now his pride and joy.
Yeah.
So I took the opportunity to get into something.
Kyle's a great guy. I'm glad that you saved that car.
Yeah, and I wouldn't quite say I saved it. If anything, I've broken more parts on it than he has.
You gave it a new life, I guess.
Yeah, it's been high horsepower for a few years, so it was time that something let go, and I just happened to be the guy that happened to.
Yeah. Well, Taylor, let's dive into it. Let's talk about let's start off with your background. What got you into tuning Evos, and can you think back to like kind of how it all started?
So I've been into cars and anything mechanical, how things work. It's always been like a fascination of mine since I was a kid. I remember like pulling apart VCRs and vacuum cleaners and stuff when I was like, I want to say a adolescent toddler, let's call it, probably around like 5, 6.
Okay.
And I've always asked how or why, which drove my parents nuts, but it's led me down the path of always wanting to learn more and just understand things as a system as opposed to just individual concepts. And I think that's where a lot of my like experiences has stemmed from, because I don't just view it as A to B type transaction. It's an A through Z. And I actually got started with a lot of niche market stuff, things that weren't really common, projects that other people didn't want to touch. I formed TailorTuned back in 2012, and that was when I started doing things professionally. But before that, I want to say when I was 17, 18, 19, I had a bunch of buddies that had some oddball builds, a couple MX6s with the JDM KL motor, which was the high compression version of the KLDE. And nobody at the time tuned those. There were maybe a couple guys that messed with chip tuning, and they weren't comfortable like getting mailed chips, so they contacted me to do that. And then I messed with a friend of mine had a 1UZ swapped Mark III Supra, and I guess this is where things started to really take off for me, because this had an SDS standalone on it, which is used for experimental aircraft. They're actually still in business to this day, but it's basically like a little Game Boy sized handheld, and it's got an up and down arrow, a plus and minus arrow, and then you would scroll through cell by cell to enter your fuel and timing values.
Wow.
And you could see why nobody wanted to touch it. And I at the time didn't know any better, but I thought it was interesting. So I'm like, oh, well, how does this work? And like, why does it function the way it does? And then that led me to doing that car for him. And it turned out well. He wound up selling it to someone else who turned it into a drift car. And then I think they actually still have it to this day, but I've since lost contact with the gentleman. But I've always owned oddball cars, 80s V6 Hondas, weird things that, nobody wanted, and just things that I thought were interesting. I burned chips for those. I got started with Hondas predominantly, stemming from that when the S300 first came out, and did a turbo Integra for a buddy of mine, a couple EP3s, SIs when they first came out with the 8th gens. And then I worked for a small boutique shop down there, and this is kind of where the Evos come into play. There was a gentleman by the name of Clinton who had a very nice Evo 10 that he was building that I got to be a part of the process. He did all of his like engine builds and tuning himself for the most part. And this is, I guess, back in the early or late forum days, depending on how you want to view it. And he was one of the first like high horsepower Evo 10s. And I almost credit him with sort of being a mentor to like Evo Scan and ECU Flash, because he kind of showed me how things worked with that, because he knew I was messing with like burning chips and doing Honda stuff. And then I did tuning for the shop that I worked for at the time, but I had never really messed with anything outside of, just the oddball stuff that nobody else really wanted to do. As being a new guy and young at that point, nobody really wanted to trust you with their, $20,000-$30,000 build.
Right.
And understandably so, because with time is experience, and you could start doing something at the age of 15 and be a professional by the age of 20, but a lot of older people don't really view that, from the positive light, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I definitely relate to kind of having a soft spot in my heart for the unique cars that don't get a lot of love.
Here's a guy on YouTube that I watch. He's been doing stuff for years with Mitsubishi's. Jafro Mobile. He does all the oddball cult stuff, and I think what he does is really cool, because he does just things that nobody would do, but
Right.
he does it all in his garage, and it's fun to watch. The unloved platforms are unique in their own right.
Yep. Plus, Jaffro's just such a cool guy.
Yeah, he seems very down to earth.
Yep.
I unfortunately haven't met him, and I would love to at some point, but he's always been somebody that I've watched over the years, and he's very detail oriented and seems to love what he does just for the process of it, and not so much looking for an ultimate end result.
Yep. I think what I can appreciate about him, what I think a lot of people really enjoy, is that he doesn't just do stuff; he does it all well, no matter how small or large the project is.
Right. And even if it takes him, a few tries to get it right, he wants to get it right.
Yeah. Well, Taylor, you talked a little bit about, kind of evolving and different options that became available later on, as you progressed in your skill. Do you have like a preferred ECU now that you like to work with over the others?
Um, I really am partial to the Link hardware. They're, I don't want to say newer, but they were kind of an underdog for a while in the industry. Um, believe they either absorbed Vipec or they used to be Vipec or they used their hardware. Uh, I haven't really delved too much into their history, but I remember when they went from like the G3, G4 software, which was popular with a lot of like oddball Subaru stuff.
Hmm.
When a G4 Plus came out is when I started using them, and I uh, started using them in my nitrous Honda, and then a friend of mine at the time was building a Turbo Del Sol with a single cam, and we wound up using it in his car. And then a friend of mine also had a G4 Plus in his Evo 8. And then that's kind of where I started messing with them. And it was a nice alternative to other options on the market because the price is really attractive. Now it's a lot more competitive with what's out there, but it's still a little cheaper than, say, a Haltech.
Hmm.
But it's very feature rich and it's easy to use. So they have a couple different fueling strategies where you can either use their simplified version, which is really just dumbed down, enter some values on a table for your fueling. It's not based on VE. Uh, VE is calculated from those numbers, but like you enter your injector data like you would anything else, and then you can edit it on that. Or you can use their more complex models, which actually uses true volumetric efficiency, and it'll take into account, fuel pressure and temperature to calculate your fuel density. You can tell it, what your ethanol content is if you're using an odd uh, fuel that has like a specific gravity that isn't quite, ethanol, but it's not, a methanol or gasoline based fuel if it's got a heavy oxygenation content, or, just for whatever reason, if it's got a bunch of lead additives in it, you can tell it what the specific gravity of the fuel is. And based on all that, it'll more accurately give you your final fueling value. A lot of ECUs have that baked in. Like the Haltech has something similar, but you can really start to add a lot of things that make the model way more accurate than it should be, at least for what the price point of the ECU is. And you don't get a lot of those features till you move up to something like a Motec or, like a Cyvex or an M-Tron, something on the upper tier of the market.
Hmm.
So, and the level of things that you can do with it for it not being, the top dog is actually very impressive. And I feel that it's a good product to offer to my customers just because it's not breaking the budget, but you get everything that you should be getting with a standalone.
Yeah. I think the what goes kind of it falls on deaf ears a lot of times, in my opinion, and I'm sure you can back this up. But just I know that the intro price to a standalone is higher than a stock ECU, but for the safeties that you get, I think it's always well worth the price. Compared to the price of having your engine completely rebuilt.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, any standalone that's worth its weight should have the ability to do that. So like Haltech and everybody else usually has some level of, you can put in a cut for, if your oil pressure dips out of range, or, if you're over boosting, if fuel pressure drops. There may even be like a compensation if it's noticing fuel pressure, falling off.
Hmm.
And I mean, firsthand experience with the Link, on our drag car, we had it part and had turned off, the circuit breakers for the main fuel pumps, just so that, when we were keying over, we weren't, accidentally, you know, hosing the shop down with fuel, because
Right.
we were doing some updates to the dash and some other things. And, in the moment of getting it running, we had forgotten to turn the main pumps back on, but turned the lift pump on. And we're, running it in the shop, idling it, setting, base timing. And just checking things over, and we go to move it, and we notice like, oh man, this thing's running real weird. So I plug the laptop in, and I notice it's got like 8 pounds of fuel pressure, and I'm like, that doesn't seem right. So thinking that we had like a sensor issue, we swap sensors and everything else, and then we get the same result. And then we're sitting there, and I'm like, this thing's running too good for it to have 8 pounds of fuel pressure. But like, let me just check and make sure that like nothing weird's going on. So like, we went back, just front to back, just looked everything over, made sure that nothing was like missing. And then turns out we opened the trunk, and the circuit breaker's off, and we're like, that's weird. So we turn them on and fire it up, and it's running exactly the same. And I'm like, that's weird. But the fueling compensation is so good that you can run the car on just the lift pump and zero fuel pressure, basically. And that was, I guess, what was the golden seal on top of things, where I just fully committed to wanting to use that on just about everything. Because I don't think I've ever had another standalone that would do that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's stuff that I haven't gotten the pleasure of working with yet. Like, I haven't touched a Motec. I know that they're, the king of kings when it comes to things. And they may have, something that will do that. But for the price point of where we're speaking, this is probably one of the best standalones that you can get with, the feature set.
Okay. Well, Taylor, you spoke about it a little bit when talking about burning chips and things that we used to have to do. But I want to talk, I want someone who's more knowledgeable about it to explain how far we've come in really not that many years when it comes to technology. I mean, it seems like not that long ago we were, using SAFCs, and now we have wireless, we can connect to our ECU via Wi-Fi, and our ECU controls not just the engine, the transmission, but the entire body harness. Also, it's crazy to me.
Yeah, and I've messed with everything from carburetors to the newest Link software, which you can log via Wi-Fi and everything else if you need to. Like if you have a track car, it's pretty much seamless as long as you have good stable internet. But yeah, from back in the day, like you said, we had the SAFC, which was basically just, tricking the map or the MAF sensor, whichever the car used to deliver more or less fuel based on, your injectors and everything else. And they worked okay for, OBD0 and OBD1 cars, but, with the OBD2 stuff in 96, like it started to not work as great because you had O2 sensors that were adding fuel trims, and it would basically in a way undo your map because it's learning around it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had you could burn onto like your base EPROM if your ECU was something that was developed at the time. You could unsolder your EPROM, solder in a socket, and then there was you could burn two maps onto a chip and have like a map switch that way, which was really popular with a lot of the Honda stuff. And then you had electronically erasable EPROMs later in time, and then some of them were you had to clear them with a UV light. They had like a little piece of tape or cover that you would put over the sensor so that you didn't have to accidentally wipe your map out, if you left the cover off. But you'd have to take the chip out and put it into a little UV cabinet to clear the code off of it. And now, like you said, we're able to flash and write cars over Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and it's a whole different ball game. Processing speeds now with ECUs are leaps and bounds faster. That you couldn't run half the things you do today on any of the technology that we did from years ago. And the fact that a lot of us were able to work with it and make the power that we did without something going awry is amazing in hindsight. And it's probably part skill and part dumb luck, but we worked with what we had.
Yep. Well, Taylor, obviously you've had your hands on a lot of different vehicles over the years. Do you have like a preferred fuel and or turbo setup that you've just found works just perfectly?
So, I mean, every platform is different. As far as fuel goes, I want something that has, the most octane and that's, readily available. Um, Back in the day, we were limited to, gasoline-based fuels. Q16 and C16 were basically the standard, depending on your application and, depending on how much power you wanted to make, if you were running an intercooler, things like that. And then ethanol came onto the market, uh, early 2000s, and that was kind of the game changer for everybody because it's alcohol based, it burns so much cooler, but it also puts a much larger demand on the fuel system. So it's a give and take, but now we have injector technology and fuel pumps that, support it. My go-to for, anything high horsepower is going to be something ethanol based. Whether it's in our case, we're an Ignite dealer. We run Ignite Red in the drag cars, and then we'll use their yellow to blend down to E85 and whatever mixture that I need on the dyno.
Mm-hmm.
Pump gas sucks. You can run 93 octane and make 400 or 500 horsepower on four cylinder safely, and then the V8 guys have it spoiled because they can make 800 1,000 horsepower at the drop of a hat and not really have to worry about it because they have twice the displacement, four more cylinders, things like that. But as far as imports go, you're limited mostly by your octane, and then your setup around that is going to be also a determining factor because you can't just put an 88 millimeter turbo on a four cylinder and keep all your response. It just doesn't have the base airflow to do that. You really create a top end monster and really something that's just a dyno queen or a drag car at that point. So, I mean, every application is going to be different. In terms of the Evo 10 platform, if you're looking to build something that's very responsive for like a track car that's not going to be too overly stressed, a G30 or even a G35, if you want, the next step up in power, is a really good starting point for a full frame turbo. If you're looking for something stock location, the AGT 64 mil, 62, 58, all his stuff is really good. And that's good for someone that isn't really looking to go to a full size turbo just yet, but still wants more power. And the stock location stuff has its downfalls and limitations. You can only fit so much turbine wheel and so much of a discharge in the stock style housing.
Right.
So you're limited there in terms of, overall exhaust manifold pressure and things like that. Even you can have equivalent sized wheels and the full frame turbo is still going to make more power and usually be more responsive just because it can breathe better.
Is there a limitation, Taylor, that you found? I'm trying to think to where some of the fastest Evo 10s turbos are placed. Is there a squeeze in, coming from the firewall, or is there plenty of room to work with back there?
It depends on housing size. I mean, you're not going to fit a 1,200 horsepower turbo, snug up against the firewall and give yourself
Mm-hmm.
room to work. And a lot of it is also ease of access if, God forbid something goes wrong. Because at the power levels a lot of the drag cars are, you want to have everything in a place that you can get to it if you need to change it out in a hurry.
For sure.
In my experience doing fabrication, because I haven't always been just a calibrator. I was a one-man band for many years, and I got out of the wrenching side of things to just focus on what I really enjoy doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still a good fabricator. It's just I only really do it on my personal stuff. But when I build a turbo manifold, or for example, when Kyle builds a turbo manifold, we're both thinking about, serviceability and ease of install. There's a lot of turbo kits on the market where getting the manifold on and off is a pain in the ass because you can't get, the same size tool on, two of the nuts that you can on the rest of them.
Yeah.
Or, you have to take the turbo out of the hot side and separate, the center cartridge and everything to get the hot side onto the manifold and then slide the turbo in. Whereas, if you just move a couple things or like place a turbo in a different location, you can get a better installation. You can get a subjectively better look depending on, the style that you're going for. And then you can more effectively manage heat, in some applications. I know sidewinders on Evo 10s tend to move heat away from the firewall, but in a less ideal spot in terms of airflow. So they are not always favorable to a street car, but it does make it more accessible in like a drag application where we shit the turbine wheel out because we're running 80 pounds of boost and the turbo finally decided it's time to punch out. We need to swap it in 15 minutes in between rounds. You loosen a couple V-band clamps and some fittings and you swap it out in 10 minutes as opposed to trying to monkey around behind the engine and get your big mitts in there and, try to get everything out, and you're dropping the 10 millimeter or, you're 14 or you're 12 and now you can't get to it because everything's out of the way.
Now it's in the boat and you're looking for it.
Yeah, you drop a socket in between the transfer case and the block and you're not finding it. So
yeah. Well, Taylor, I'm kind of I'm the type of person where I believe that forums are both a great thing and a bad thing because there's a lot of good information, but then there's also a lot of bad information. And, it's not just the forums nowadays. Facebook is also guilty of this. Have you seen like tuning myths or things that are just blatantly wrong about Evos that are out there that you just wish would die off?
So unfortunately, the internet is forever, whether it's good information or bad information. And there's some, I guess, I don't want to say that they're myths, but misunderstandings about the platform. And it all really comes down to user error too. So, for example, my car is entirely stock driveline, front to back transmission, transfer case, drive shaft, rear end, axles. They are all factory original. I broke the final drive in the transmission, which was the only aftermarket part in it. It was a 418, and I think that we just had a bad batch of them because they all seem to break, but all the 430 installs that we've done have lasted for years and haven't given us an issue. So now I'm switching to a 430. I'm just going to rev it out more to get the extra mile an hour that I need. But everyone thinks that the driveline is the weak part, and it can be. It is not the strongest, rear end from factory in the Evo 10 because of the AYC. You have an aluminum case, you start putting a lot of horsepower to it, it flexes, it can break. And not that mine is bulletproof, but I know that there's other, 9-10 second cars that are running stock driveline and they're just fine. But then there's people breaking them running, 11s, 12s, making less power. And it ultimately comes down to driver error. I've seen people make a bunch of horsepower on the stock engine. It's not something I would recommend doing, but there were a lot of myths early on that you needed to sleeve the block right away if you wanted to make more than, 500-600 horsepower. Our base engine package at Co-Performance is, the 750 long block or short block that doesn't have sleeves in it. And we've made, 800 plus horsepower on an unsleeved motor. Now, for longevity purposes, we don't have one with 100,000 miles on it quite yet, but, running 40, 45 pounds of boost, they seem to hold up just fine. We've actually seen more issues with sleeved motors from just machine shops not installing the sleeves properly, and they'll drop and you'll have a head gasket issue that way. Whereas, with the non-sleeve stuff, it's from Mitsubishi that way. And they wouldn't put something out that was going to be an issue for longevity long-term. Granted, you start leaning on any stock part and it's going to be an issue at some point. And now, what was the first one? 2008, and we're 2025. So like the youngest car, is, 12, 13 years old.
Right.
Like it's not a young platform anymore. And sorry, it's the oldest car, but it's, you get to the point in the Hondas with the B series stuff, the blocks are, 25 years old, and they're wondering why they're starting to see cracks and break them. And granted, those cars can make 1,200 horsepower on a sleeve block, but you start to stress out metal. Over time, it doesn't matter what material it is, it's going to fatigue and fail. It doesn't matter what it is. So it's one of those things, like you play with fire a little bit when you start making a lot of horsepower, but you also have to make sure that like your machinist is competent, because ultimately any tuner that is competent enough can make horsepower. Making the horsepower on our end is actually the easy part of the job. The hard part of our job is all the minutia of, getting it to run and idle and drive properly. The reliability comes from, the machinist and the engine builder that's doing the final assembly. And, if it's not machined properly, and, the sleeves aren't installed to spec, or, your valve train's not lashed correctly, or your ring gap's not right, you're going to have a failure. And ultimately it's up to the guy that's building the motor to really figure all that stuff out and know what he's looking at. As far as myths go, it's really hard to point a finger at anything that's specific in my mind, but those are what I would think of off the top of my head.
Yeah. So Taylor, this is something that is near and dear to my heart, because the first time I ever had my car tuned, I had no idea what I was, kind of getting myself into. So when someone brings you a car for tuning, or when you log in remotely to tune a car, what are the most common mistakes that you see people make, either when it comes to setting up their car or just overall being prepared?
So the most common mechanical issue I see is like a boost leak, or fuel pressure not being set properly, base timing not being set properly. As far as the customer themselves, I think if someone's new to the tuning world, they don't understand the amount of time it actually takes. And YouTube and Facebook, I guess, have kind of given people a false expectation of, oh, it's just a 30-minute process, it's on and off the dyno like that, because you don't see all the work that goes into it.
Right.
That really needs to be done. So when I get a car, my process is, one, look over the entire build. And I try not to really be too nitpicky, because, some people are working with what they got, but there's a minimum standard that I have before I'll really even like touch a car. So I'm looking for immediate things like fire hazards, safety hazards for the customer, how clean is the install, or the wires everywhere, because the last thing I want is to be doing a pull in the dyno and your boost control wires are too close to, the manifold, and all of a sudden, I have no wastegate control, or, say you have a vacuum line that's not secured properly and that pops off. And now all of a sudden we're running 45 pounds of boost when we're really only targeting, 20, 25.
Right.
And it's really just a attention to detail thing. There's a lot of competent shops that get it right the first time, but we're all human. It doesn't matter how good you are. Someone's going to make a mistake somewhere. They could be having a bad morning. They could be having family issues. And you never really know like what you're getting. So it's just a start from point A and make sure everything's done right. And just, I am the final, point of failure before, something goes wrong. So it's my job to make sure, like, hey, was everything done correctly that needed to be done before I touch this? Because if there's a vacuum leak or a boost leak, or something isn't, set properly, my job's not going to go well.
Right.
So if it's not If it doesn't meet all its checks and balances, then I won't touch it until that's fixed. And usually there's nothing major that goes on. 9 out of 10 times it's really just this clamp was loose or base fuel pressure was off, things like that. Um, but I've had somebody bring me a car where they're like, "Hey, it's ready for you to tune," and the car comes on a trailer not running, and half the wiring still needs to be finished, and I'm just like sit there and I have to rub my temples a little bit and be like, "This isn't ready to tune. It'll be ready to tune when all this other stuff is finished, and then I make sure it all works."
Right. And I think that's what has to be frustrating to tuners. Is it feels to me like people think that they're there to diagnose, not tune.
Yeah, and it's not our job to diagnose. We have the ability to, as long as your tuner has sound mechanical knowledge. He should be able to figure out like if you have a misfire or something else, and he should know like more or less what the issue could possibly be. But it's our job to plug into the car, do your idle, your drivability, your startup, and then make horsepower. It's not our job to finish your build, and it it almost feels sometimes like our time doesn't get respected from some parties, and at that point they're not a customer. uh, and you always have a bad egg in the industry. It doesn't matter where you work or what you do. You'll always have a customer that is entitled, that they want their stuff done right now over everybody else's, and they don't care that they didn't do it right. They want you to fix their problem.
Right. Exactly. Well, Taylor, you kind of spoke about it a little bit before, but there's a difference between being able to tune a bass tune and being able to tune for drivability and to have just a very smooth running vehicle. So, what's the process like for dialing in that drivability versus just chasing peak power and trying to get the highest number on the dyno that you can?
So a good calibration is going to be based off of, is all of your data correct? Is your injector data right? If you're working with a stock ECU, is your math curve correct? Are your load tables set up properly? In the event of a standalone, like, do you have a good VE table? Like, do you know like what your VE table should look like? Because with every cam choice, that's going to change. With every turbo choice, that's going to be shaped different. So if you don't have a name brand injector that doesn't have, sound data, you're not going to get a car that idles or drives or starts worth a damn, because you're guessing at that point. And then any other data that you put in from there is not going to be correct because your base data isn't done properly. You have to think of it like building a house. Your foundation is going to be, make sure all of your sensors are scaled right, make sure your injector data is right, and then from there you can start to lay the rest of the bricks for everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have that foundation, then you can start worrying about, okay, does the car start? Like, how much fuel is it going to need? Like, what is it idle like? And then from there, you can start moving into drivability and dialing in, your your cruising trims, and make sure it accelerates cleanly from light to light, make sure it's not stalling, all the little things that you almost take for granted with a stock car. And you almost have to, in my mind, there's a difference between a tuner and a calibrator. Every calibrator is a tuner, but not every tuner is a calibrator. There's guys that are just getting started, or that maybe just haven't wanted to go the extra mile and learn more, but they view it as just okay, I want it at this number and make this power.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't care what it runs or drives like. And in a race car application, that might be fine. But I view it as, if I was Mitsubishi, or if I was Nissan, or whatever platform I'm tuning, how would I want this car to run for someone to take it to work every day? And you do lose drivability when you go with like a larger turbo and bigger cams. Like, you're not going to have a heavily modified 1,000 horsepower 4-cylinder that drives like a stock car. And
Right.
you're gonna have little issues here and there that like there's just nothing you can do about it because that's the nature of the beast. But you should still be able to get as close as possible to that because you're looking at it as a system standpoint and not just an individual like approach. And I think that's where a lot of people forget that it's not just I just turn the boost up and make the power. Like that's the easiest part. Like the wide open throttle stuff, I can have a flex fuel car done in an hour to 2 hours. As long as everything else has gone smoothly before that, I'm done making power in less than 30 runs. And a lot of tuners will sit there and do 50, 60, 70 pulls on a car and, not get anywhere with it because they're fighting all their drivability stuff. When a customer brings a car to Kyle and I, or just to me, I will go over the car, I'll make sure everything's good, and then I'll actually take the car out and drive it as if like it was my daily driver. I'll get permission from the customer if it's a road going car. And then I'll take it out, I'll take it to work, I'll take it to the grocery store, live with it for a day or two. And just make sure that, it starts, it idles, it runs, it doesn't do anything goofy. And if all that's sound, then you can start worrying about making horsepower. Because at that point, you know that the car itself is running the way it should be. You can put any car on the dyno and just whack it and try to make power. And again, if you're competent enough, you'll end up, if you have 1,000 horsepower turbo, you'll end up at 1,000 horsepower, if you know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But is that same 1,000 horsepower going to be as responsive as somebody else's map? Is it going to, idle and cruise like somebody else's tune would? And that's, I think, the biggest thing that people overlook is like, what does it drive like? Because I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to get in a car that I can't enjoy driving.
Oh, for sure.
And I've overbuilt cars in the past where it's just like, man, I hate driving this thing. I don't know why I put solid motor mounts in it. I don't know why I gutted the thing. Like, that's why my drag car has a full interior. Like, I don't care if it's the fastest thing out there, but I want to be able to take it on a drag and drive and not sweat my nuts off while we're going from track to track. I want to be able to cruise with the radio on and the AC on and still be able to go home in the thing. And if I break something, I got parts in the trailer.
Yep. I agree 100%. And it makes me think of, I see a YouTube video or somebody post a Facebook video of them, making 800 horsepower, and then they go to the track and you can tell it's barely running coming up to the line. You think, oh, well, I don't know what they were thinking here.
Right. And so even with a race car, like say we're building like a time attack or a drag car, I'm going to make sure that you can be able to fire it up and drive it through the pits, and that, you can at least cruise on a caution lap if you're on track and you're not sitting there shaking your teeth out because the car, is too lean or has way too much cam timing and you're cruising RPM. And that's just as important as being able to send it, 145, 160 miles an hour down the track as it is driving up the lanes. Because the car can't do a burnout and you stall. Or if you can't line up and keep the thing idling, like you're making the driver do more work. And, it's kind of embarrassing if the car just doesn't want to run.
Yep. I feel like you hear that, not a lot, but you hear it often where somebody's having to give it gas just to keep it running up the line because they did not tune for a cold start.
Right. And there's a lot of cars that now with the technology that we have with drive-by-wire, there's no excuse for it. But back in the day, people would delete like the idle air control valve and everything else. And like, you'd have to do that. But like now, like there's no reason. Like you have a drive-by-wire car, like it should idle. There is no valve that you have to worry about leaking or breaking, because with the 8s and 9s, if you're still in a stock throttle body, like that valve can fail. It's not common, but the cars now at this point are, 20 plus years old. So parts fail. And I get it. Some people just want to put the biggest throttle body on there with no actuator and just set it to a screw and, let their idle be, 11, 12, 1300 RPM. And that's fine. But you're not going to have, a dash pod or a stall saver function. You might have it stall because, you have a twin disc in it and it's way lighter than the factory flywheel is. Like there's no momentum there.
Mm-hmm.
But with today's technology, there's really no excuse for it. And a lot of the dry cars now that are out, like they'll start up and run and drive and idle and go up to lanes and they don't have any issues. And the technology is really a part of it. But if you don't know what you're doing with that technology, then it doesn't matter if you have, two jumper cables and a welding rod, or if you have, a fancy TIG welder, you're not going to be able to use either tool. So, and, rock, hammer, screwdriver, it doesn't matter. If you're not using any of them right, you're not going to get a good result.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Taylor, in your experience, what's been the most challenging Evo platform to tune, and why?
I want to say challenging is not the right word, because for me, it's all easy. As long as the parts combination is good, my job's honestly fairly enjoyable, which is why I enjoy doing it. I like making horsepower and I like seeing the customer happy and get to enjoy their car at the end of the day. In terms of, I guess, a challenge, it would be working with older platforms that don't have like variable valve timing. So like the Evo 8 would be a perfect example, or older models. Anything without MyVec, you start to lose out in the mid-range and you lose spool time when you don't have that to take advantage of, because on the older cars you dial in your cams to your cam card, and then you can vary one way or the other to try to pick up a little more in the top end or a little more in the mid range, or maybe just dial out overlap in general to broaden your power band. But you can't adjust that while the engine's running, so you have to kind of pick your happy medium and then you're stuck with it. And that's the biggest challenge with making, 1,000 horsepower on something like that is, you're stuck with the settings that you dial in on the engine stand or, on the dyno, and that's it. Whereas the Evo 9 and the Evo 10, you can run a much larger cam, and then you set your exhaust gear on those, because once you get to a large enough cam on the 10, you should have like a Magnus exhaust gear delete, so that that's not wandering around. Or in the case of the 9, you put an adjustable gear on the exhaust and you dial that in, and then you play with the intake, and that'll kind of help your spool time and, give you a nicer idle characteristic, as opposed to, say you're running a 280 cam and it just sits there, chopping away, which everybody likes, but it doesn't make for the best, street manners. And it makes it a little easier to have the best of both worlds. Once you get to a certain turbo size, though, you're not going to have any low end, no matter how much MyVec you throw at it. But you want to at least try to keep your power band as broad as possible. That way, you're making the best average horsepower, because really that's what's going to win you a race. And one of the points that I know we're going to get to is like the dyno queens. You can have two cars that make 1,000 horsepower. Well, if one makes 1,000 horsepower for half a second, and another one makes 1,000 horsepower for a second and a half,
right,
that car is going to be faster than the other one. Your average power production is what's going to win you the race and get you down the track. If you only make 1,000 horsepower at 9,000 RPM, but you make 300 at 5,500, whereas the other car makes 500 at 5,500 and 1,000 at 9,000, then you're going to have a much faster car. And that's the where the term power under the curve comes from when you're looking at a chart. And a lot of people focus just on that peak number. And so the dyno that I use is a Mustang dyno, and I get the disappointment of, oh, that's all the power it made. That's what it made before. I've had the opportunity to, put the old map back on the car and then run it back to back, and the car actually makes less in the old map because it was just too soft on their tune, which, granted, every dyno is just a tool. That's all it is. And it's only as good as it's calibrated and as well as it's maintained. Racing dynos is probably the dumbest thing that has happened since, YouTube came about and everybody started, having horsepower wars. Like, we know a dyno jet reads more. That's great. I can make my Mustang dyno read, 30% higher than it does if I really want to. But I would rather have it calibrated for the correct number, and that's it. Like, I don't want to overinflate it and then have you say, oh, it makes 1,200 horsepower, and then you go get beat by something that makes 1,000 wheel,
right?
And then you're like, oh, I thought it made 1,200 horsepower. Why is it not faster? I hear all the time for cars that I've done, they're like, dude, it's so much faster at this power than it was at the old one. And there's times where I'll make maybe 20 or 30 more horsepower, but it is just a way faster car. And partially because it makes more power under the curve. But if you take a car that makes, say, 700 horsepower on a dyno jet and put it right on a Mustang dyno, you're automatically reading at least 10% lower, and that's just off rip. There's a ton of variables there. But, I've had cars I've done that make 700-800 horsepower keep up with cars that made 1,000 horsepower on a dyno jet.
Mm-hmm.
And the owners then can't believe it. They're like, I don't understand. And I'm like, it's just a tool. Like, I could tell you that your car makes 1,000 horsepower. I have a dyno jet readout on that dyno that we set up, and you add in your drivetrain loss and everything else, and you'll get that same number, but it's just a number.
Right. Dynos weren't meant to be dick measuring contests, as they say.
Right. And realistically, it comes down to how fast is your car, going down the track, or how fast is your car around the track.
Yeah.
It should really be the racing that does the talking and not the dyno sheet. The dyno sheet is just a way to know that the car is doing what it should be doing, and really for, product testing and R&D. And that's mostly what, I look at is if I have two identical setups and I know one is making, 100 less horsepower than the one that I just did, I know I have an issue. And that's what it should be used for. It shouldn't be, oh, I need to make 1,000 horsepower because my buddy on the internet said that this should make 1,000 horsepower. At the end of the day, if you have 1,000 horsepower turbo, you're only making 1,000 horsepower at the crank. You're not going to make that to the wheels. And that's another thing that people really forget about, is a lot of these parts that companies put out are rated for crank horsepower, not wheel. With the Evo 10, you have a transmission, a transfer case, and rear end, and four wheels that you're turning. Whereas if you put that same turbo on, Honda, that the transmission weighs nothing and you're only turning two wheels, like, you're going to make more power at the wheel at the same crank horsepower, whereas, you're just turning a bunch more weight. And it's frustrating sometimes because everyone's like, well, they said it would make 1,000 and it made 1,000 on this dyno, and, all this. And I'm like, you can make a dyno read whatever you want it. There's ways to trick every single one. It's harder with some, but again, at the end of the day, it's just a tool. And as long as the car runs good and it runs the time that it should, then you're fine. The easiest way to make sure that you're getting what you should be out of your turbo is, with a good standalone, you should be able to see what your fuel flow is if you have the right sensors and everything. And, look at your airflow in pounds, and then look at your fuel flow in pounds, and then know, where things are jiving. And then you can calculate horsepower from there. That's how I validate, like, what the dyno is saying. Or take a factory car, for instance, and we know, like, if the car makes 350 horsepower at the crank from factory, put it on the dyno, subtract your drivetrain losses, run it. And if the power at the wheels is within that like couple percent error, then it's calibrated well. And Mustang really does a good job with a lot of their math. So as long as you as the end user aren't, futzing around with anything, it's pretty accurate out of the box as long as you're maintaining it and keeping up with your updates and all that.
I know that there's people that say you can tell, you can estimate a car's horsepower based off its trap speed too. Do you know anything about that?
Uh, you can, to a point, because you're gonna have ultimately your trap time and your mile an hour is going to be dictated by your front half of the track. So if your 60 foot's good, you're going to mile an hour better out the back, and you're going to have better time overall. But if you bog off the line and you have to make up all your time, then your trap time is going to be less. During testing, one of the cars that we have that made 800 and change was trapping 140 miles an hour, really with a terrible launch. I think we maybe got like a 1.9 or a 2.0 60 foot out of it, and had a terrible short track, but it mile an hour out the back like a rocket ship. So you can kind of use that more or less, but you really have to have the car and the driver be consistent to use that as a measuring stick, because you can affect your overall mile an hour by aerodynamics and weight as well. It's not just your horsepower. If you have two cars that make the same power and one weighs 500 pounds less, it's going to be faster overall than the heavier car. So you can kind of gauge it like that if you wanted to, but I don't feel that that's accurate or honest, in my opinion.
Gotcha. All right, so Taylor, we kind of spoke about it a little bit, but it seems to be a thing in the Mitsubishi world where we don't really balance the power and reliability. We just kind of put the power as the priority and kind of hope it stays together. Whenever you're tuning, a customer car, how do you balance the power and the reliability and kind of make them equal priorities?
So your ultimate reliability is really going to be determined by the engine build itself and all the parts that are on it. How well was the engine assembled? Was it assembled cleanly? Is the maintenance done on it like it's supposed to be? Are the parts that are on it of good quality? That's what's ultimately going to determine the real reliability of it. Going back again, if you're a competent tuner, you're not going to leave it on the blazing edge to make all the power in the world. I'll personally leave, a couple degrees out of it coming off the dyno and let it be a little bit richer than what we, had it on the dyno, just so that things stay cooler. And there's little tricks that you can do as far as compensations go and things to help keep things cool. But ultimately, you're looking for, keeping your charge air temperatures in check, keeping a good octane fuel in it. Your balance in reliability and power is what did you spend up front? Because I guess the old saying is good, fast, or cheap. Pick two.
Right.
If cheap and fast, it's not going to be good. And the aspect, if you spend the money and it's fast, chances are it's going to be good. So if you use the cheapest parts, but you want the most horsepower, it's not going to last. And I see that all too often as people they'll go onto their favorite parts website, they'll hit sort by price, cheapest first, and they'll pick that fuel system, that turbo, those injectors, and then they'll bring it to their favorite builder and be like, here, install this. And that's why I don't do customer supplied parts when I'm doing an install. Kyle tends to not do it either. And if you're really adamant about using it, then we'll use it, but we're going to charge you for it because we already know that this is going to be a headache down the road,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and not for nothing, like a lot of these companies will undercut their, their minimum advertised price and really just try to sell you a product just to sell it. And they don't care what their, ultimate profit is if they're making some money. I would rather sell you a part that I make no margin on because it's good rather than sell you junk and, know that you're going to get the better end product where, parts company A is just going to sell you whatever you put in the cart and they don't really care. And a
Right.
lot of the people that work for those companies aren't always cart people. They don't always know what's best and they, you know,
They're
will
just,
recommend the wrong parts.
yeah. That's what I think. A lot of people confuse some of these because they seem like car people, but really they're just salespeople.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, you have to be salesy in this industry, like if you're trying to make money and not in the bad aspect, but like you have to know your product and you have to be able to explain it to the customer. Uh, and you have to be able to pitch it in a way that they understand because I could tell you all the technical reasons why an injector dynamics injector or a fuel injector clinic injector is better than, your XYZ brand that, is just a Bosch core that, another company purchased and put in their Chinese flow bench tester and tried to make a matched set. Whereas, the larger companies actually have this, you know, multi-thousand-dollar machine that they've sat and batched their injectors and tested them for reliability. And they actually have plotted out data so that you can then, put that into your standalone and get a good end result.
Yep. Absolutely. So Taylor, you talked about it a little bit about tuning both for street applications and race applications. Whenever you're you talk about setting the base and then getting the drivability and then going for power. How how do you approach that going for power portion on a street car versus a race car?
Honestly, they're very much the same. Actually, in a race application, you will almost have more safeties in place than you will for most of your street cars.
Hmm.
Because a lot of guys are still using the stock ECU, which is honestly very powerful and it's very good for what it is. Like Mitsubishi did a good job with that, and it's a very misunderstood instrument. There's a lot of tables that were defined and not really described properly in their functions. And I've actually, gotten a chance to dig into some of the code and rewrite some things to get it to do what I need it to do. But especially in terms of like the SST, but the approach is very similar aside from, if you have a street car that's more budget oriented, you might stick with the stock ECU and you might only be limited with like a boost cut and, a couple safeties that the factory ECU can handle. Whereas, if you go with a standalone, whether it's a street car or, a race car, your uh, your approach is going to be, outfit it with as many safeties as you can afford. And my thought is how much money are you willing to invest to protect yourself from yourself now? Because at the end of the day, if you're focused on driving the car, you can't watch the dash for every little warning light that could pop up.
Right.
And I'm guilty of it. I don't care if the car is misfiring going for a pass. I'm going to stay in it. So in order to save me from myself, now that I have the technology, I'll put a safety on. If oil pressure falls out of range, if fuel pressure falls out of range, if battery voltage drops, it'll kill the coils completely. And that's it. The pass is done. And then I get to figure out, well, why did it do that? And that might cost me the race, but it's cheaper than, putting another 30, 40, $50,000 engine in the thing because I just ignorantly wanted to keep my foot in it, as opposed to, well, this $100 sensor and, a couple minutes of my time really actually save the investment. And there's a leeway with some stuff where with a customer car, I'll be a little more cautious because I know that most customers aren't as, technologically savvy as, myself or, anybody that's been building it. There's a reason why they pay us to do the job.
Right.
And there will be more safety there. And I'd rather them call me and be like, hey, the car shut off mid-pass. I'm not sure why. Can you look at this log? Rather than, hey, man, the engine just scattered itself because the vacuum line popped off and it ran all of the boost for a second and a half. And now my crankshaft's on the floor and it's your fault.
Yeah. And, I feel like you hear those horror stories a lot where they just didn't listen to the car, didn't pay attention enough.
Yep, and I had it recently with somebody that I know where they had an install error that they didn't catch, and they wound up, hurting the motor, and it happens. Like, we're human, but it was avoidable had there been, proper safety in place. And even if there is, sometimes there's only so much that safety is going to do based on, what ECU you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, if the boost cut on the factory ECU is a fuel cut, if you blow a wastegate line off and you decide to just drive through that cut, well, now you're running it lean at more boost. And if the tuner didn't put in, a row of cells above your boost target that have, less timing in it, you're running it lean with a bunch of timing in it, and it's going to melt something down. Whereas, on standalone, you can have it set up as a spark cut or turn off everything if it way overshoots, and then you can sit there and figure out like what just happened, and fuel cuts are not the best when it comes to high horsepower applications. It's a lot of the time what the OEMs will use because it's much softer and safer than a spark cut.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get into, our realm of things where you're starting to make high horsepower, that's not what you want to use. And the spark cut might be harder on parts depending on how you implement it, but it's always going to be safer in terms of, what's going on inside of the combustion chamber.
Okay. Now, Taylor, let's take a step back. Let's say that I have a mostly stock ECU Evo for sure, and I just want to get the most out of what Mitsubishi gave me from the factory, but I want you to, get on the laptop and get the most out of it for me. Which Evo generation responds the best to just tuning alone?
That's a tough one. So the Evo 9s and the Evo 10s are pretty much tied up.
Okay.
And it really depends on what you're looking for. So the Evo 9 turbo makes a lot of horsepower on ethanol. It has MyVec, and you can take advantage of that. The Evo 10, the turbo flows a little less. And just from numbers that like I've seen, like you won't make as much power. The car's heavier as well. So it depends what you're looking for, but the Evo 10 cylinder head flows leaps and bounds better than the 4G63 does. So the 4B11, at least from a technology standpoint, is the better engine, and same thing with like ECU hardware and all that. But in terms of like what's on the engine hardware wise, like the Evo 9 turbo flows a little more than the Evo 10 does, but the cars from factory are calibrated in a way because the manufacturer has to meet, emissions and fuel economy standards, and they want the car to last for, 80 to 100,000 miles. They're not concerned with all out power. They usually leave, especially with turbocharged applications, a nice margin there where you can, wick it up and get some more out of it with more boost, more timing. And if you have the ability to, and you want to put a different fuel pump and injectors in it, like put it on ethanol and turn it up a little past that. In terms of which one's better, it's gonna again be down to personal taste and the owner themselves. I'm I would love to have an Evo 9 to daily, um, but the 10 sucks up all of the budget for the fun stuff. And then I have a few bikes as well that take all my money, so I don't have the ability to do that yet. But that would actually be my daily driver over the 10,
Okay.
just because I like the 90s 2000s era of stuff. The 10 is definitely a more comfortable car in terms of like everyday drivability and just creature comforts. But the nine's definitely more fun. I guess that's really like what you have to ask yourself is what or is going to put a bigger smile on your face,
Exactly.
not which one is the better platform for power. I mean, if that's your end goal, there's much better cars than the Evo in general for that. But the and even any four-cylinder import, and I'm an import guy, and I'll say this: I would much rather have a Corvette or a Viper if I'm going to make power. It's much easier and much cheaper generally. The cost of entry is higher, but you're working with more displacement. You're going to make power way easier than you will with a 2 liter, and that's in any make, model, brands, anywhere.
Yep. You beat me to it, but I was going to say, which car are you getting the best smiles per gallon?
Yeah, and it depends. Kyle actually had an Evo 8 a while ago that I had an FP red on it, and I think for like a street car, the 4 to 600 horsepower range, depending on chassis setup and everything else, is honestly like the sweet spot for miles per gallon, because at that power level, you really don't have to worry about braking parts so much,
Mm-hmm.
and you really get to just enjoy the car. A longtime customer of mine, Dylan, has an Evo 8 as well, and he came to me originally. Uh, believe the car was stock turbo when we met, and then we did an FP red and some GSC S2s, uh, and basic bolt-ons and some ethanol, and we had the car around 500 horsepower for, I want to say, close to 3 or 4 years on the stock bottom end, until he finally decided that he wanted to, really go crazy, and then we put a Zona turbo on it and did an engine build, switched over to Kelford cams and a bunch of other stuff, and now the car is making 800 plus horsepower, and the thing's a riot in any mode that it's in. And he's beat that car from here to next year at race motive events and everything else. All he does is maintain it. He comes in every now and then, changes the oil. We look over the car. We make sure that nothing has really changed with it, and take it out for a log, make sure it's still healthy, and then off he goes, and it runs like a top.
Okay.
The myth that built motor can't be as reliable as the factory engine, going back a couple points, is ultimately determined by how well is it built and how well is it tuned. Um, you can have a built motor last 30, 40, 50, 60,000 miles before you really need to get into it and refresh it. The 4G63s are a little more forgiving, but like with the 4B11s, like we'll drop the pans, around 30 to 50,000 miles, depending on usage, and, check rod bearings, make sure that they're still good. And, if they're making, 800 plus horsepower, they tend to get a little bit of wear on them, whether it's from, debris or, whatever. If customer changes their own oil and they're not careful, like where they store their funnel and everything else, you can introduce dirt and whatnot. But like the aftermarket stuff isn't made to the same longevity standards as the OEM stuff. Like your rings are made of a different material. Your pistons are, forged as opposed to a cast material. Your rods are heavier. Your bearings are softer. You're stressing the engine out more. So like you'll get less mileage than a factory engine, but if you maintain it well, you should get still a long life out of it. I know people who've got 80,000 miles on builds and they're still going and they haven't taken it apart yet. So it's one of those things where, if you take care of it, it'll take care of you and you'll get to enjoy it for, a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey guys, this podcast had so much information, we decided to split it up into 2 episodes. This is the end of episode 1, and we hope that you'll join us on episode 2. See you then.
Thank you for listening to the MitsuTimes podcast. Check out our Instagram and Facebook for daily updates. Get added to our list by going to MitsuTimes.org and clicking Submit a Slip. Thank you to all of our sponsors.